Yeah, I mean, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of just absolute precision.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like mechanical engineering.
Exactly. We want it to be like mechanical engineering. You know, you fall off a bike, you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right on the screen.
Right. It's binary. It's either broken or it isn't.
And the doctor just points a pen at it and says, you know, there it is. That's the problem.
And psychologically, that is incredibly comforting.
For
We
sure.
as human beings love things to be visible. I mean, we want our reality categorized neatly without any ambiguity or, gray areas.
But then you step out of the emergency room, right? And you step into this sprawling world of population level, public health, and epidemiology, and just these massive institutional data sets.
Yeah, and suddenly it's not so simple.
No. Suddenly that crisp binary x-ray machine is completely broken. We end up looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
Very murky.
You think you are looking at a clear picture of reality, but the longer you stare at the numbers, the more you realize someone behind the scenes might have been messing with the contrast style.
Which, I have to say, perfectly sets up our stack of sources for this deep dive.
It really does.
Because we are looking at a landscape today that is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
But the core argument we are exploring today is that these waters aren't just muddy by accident or, just because the science is hard.
Right.
They are, in many cases, muddy by structural design.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are exploring a truly fascinating and honestly deeply analytical critique of institutional science and public health messaging.
It's quite a read.
It is. Our source material today is essentially a taxonomy, right?
Yeah.
It's a detailed breakdown of the rhetorical strategies, the logical traps, and the study design flaws that massive institutions use to communicate data to the public.
It is a really profound look at the intersection of language, statistics, and authority. I mean, we are examining how organizations build narratives that are essentially bulletproof.
Yeah, bulletproof. But not for the reason you'd think.
Exactly. They aren't bulletproof because the underlying science is flawless. They are bulletproof because the arguments themselves are structured in a way that makes them mathematically and linguistically impossible to prove wrong.
Now, a quick heads up for you listening, this text looks heavily at pandemic-era health measures and vaccine data, which obviously is a highly politically charged space.
Very much so.
So, to be completely clear up front, we are not taking any sides here. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we dismissing them.
Right, we're just looking at the framework.
Exactly. Our job is simply to impartially report on the content provided, break down the complex arguments, and convey the ideas contained in the original source material for you to analyze. We just want you to evaluate the logic, the math, and the language for yourself.
The focus really is on the architecture of the arguments, We want to give you the tools to read a medical study or, say, watch a public health press briefing and actually see the underlying gears turning.
Have you ever looked at a massive statistical claim on the news or maybe a new health mandate and felt like the math was somehow, I don't know, playing a trick on you?
Like things aren't quite adding up.
Yeah. Like the numbers didn't quite match the reality you were observing with your own eyes, but you couldn't put your finger on exactly how the trick was done.
Well, today we are going to act as your decoder ring.
Yes, we are. We are going to explore how phenomena like the healthy user bias warp population level survival statistics, and we're going to translate a lot of dense academic epidemiological jargon into plain English.
To start stripping back those layers, the text introduces a foundational behavior. It's a conceptual maneuver that institutions use before the data is even collected.
Okay, let's unpack this.
The author describes it as establishing an assumption that is preloaded but only deployed after the fact.
Okay, let's explore that timeline. Because setting up a rule before the game starts, but only deciding to enforce it after you see the final score, that feels like a rigged casino.
It does, yeah.
How does this actually work in practice?
So the text calls this the paradox of post-hoc A-Priori assumptions.
Post-Hoc A-Priori, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
Yeah.
Let's break those Latin terms down because the mechanism is fascinating. So a priori refers to a premise you hold independent of experience.
Like it's preloaded.
Exactly. You assume it to be true before you run any tests at all. Post hoc, on the other hand, means after the fact. It is the reasoning you apply after you already know the outcome.
So an institution has a preloaded assumption sitting in their back pocket, but they don't bring it up right away.
That's the mechanic right there. They deploy these frameworks, these risk models, these presumptions of authority, but they let them sit entirely dormant.
Huh.
When a product is launched or a policy is enacted and things are going well, you never hear about these assumptions.
Right, because they don't need them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the second reality fails to match their projections. The second a product fails or causes an anomaly, those dormant assumptions are activated post hoc.
Wow.
They are brought out after the outcome to reframe a failure as a success or to excuse an error as an inevitability.
I think I need a real-world analogy for this because it's a bit abstract.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, imagine a golfer stepping up to the tee.
Right.
He takes a massive swing, and it is a terrible, ugly shot. The ball goes flying right into the water hazard.
A total slice.
A total slice. Now, instead of taking the penalty stroke, he immediately turns around to his friends and claims, oh no, that was just a practice swing.
Right.
The rule that practice swings don't count toward the score that was invented after the mistake was made. But he applies it retroactively as if that was his intention the whole time, just to protect his ego and his scorecard.
That golfer analogy captures the essence perfectly. The practice swing defense is activated post hoc to preserve the golfer's status.
Okay, I see it.
And in the realm of public health and massive government bodies, the first major assumption the text identifies that functions exactly like this is called the Axiom of Institutional Benevolence.
The Axiom of Institutional Benevolence. Let me guess. This is the baseline assumption that the house is always acting purely out of the goodness of its heart.
You nailed it.
Ah.
It is the foundational premise that institutions act solely and exclusively in the public interest.
Right.
The axiom assumes that structural incentives, legal liability shields, billions of dollars in funding dependencies, or even just plain bureaucratic self-preservation do not influence their decision-making matrix at all.
Hold on, I need to jump in here. Because aren't we assuming some cartoonish level of malice to think otherwise? I mean, do these massive agencies really sit in smoky rooms plotting to trick the public? Or is it more likely that they just make mistakes in the chaotic heat of a global crisis?
That is the beauty of the text critique, actually.
Yeah.
It doesn't require a smoky room or intentional malice at all.
It doesn't.
No, it's entirely structural.
Mm.
The critique is about how bureaucracies function as organisms designed to survive.
Ah. Okay.
When a massive error occurs or public harm happens, the institution uses this axiom of benevolence to frame the failure in moral terms.
I see.
They will say the negative outcome was unintended or tragic but necessary, or they'll say, we were just doing our best to protect the vulnerable.
Oh, wow. So by shifting the conversation to their noble intentions, they completely replace objective accountability metrics with emotional language.
Precisely.
If you question the data, you aren't seen as questioning the math. You are framed as questioning their heart.
Which creates a chilling effect on public discourse. The text describes this as a linguistic cascade of capture.
A linguistic cascade.
Yeah. If the institution is presumed to be universally benevolent, then any critic must, by default, be malevolent.
Oh, that's wild.
Questioning the institution instantly gets you labeled as a cynic or anti-science. It drastically raises the social cost of critical thinking.
That is incredibly manipulative. I mean, it traps the listener before they even have a chance to look at the spreadsheet. You are already on trial for being a bad person just for asking to see the raw data.
It's very effective.
It narrows the entire space for legitimate scientific debate.
It narrows it to the point of suffocation, honestly.
Yeah.
You aren't allowed to factor in career pressures or political expedience.
Yeah.
You have to conflate their stated intent with their actual physical outcome.
Right.
But of course, an institution can only say, we meant well for so long before the public notices that the data doesn't match the promises.
Yeah, exactly. If the boat is sinking, you can't just keep pointing to the lifeboats you forgot to install and say, well, we intended to build them.
The water is still coming in.
The water is still coming in. So once they establish this moral high ground, how do they handle the actual tangible data when a highly publicized intervention fails to do what they promised?
They handle it by changing the rules of the game while the game is still being played.
Yeah.
The text explores a phenomenon we've all likely witnessed, but maybe didn't have the vocabulary to describe. It's the process of retreating from an initial grand promise by constantly shifting the criteria for success.
I remember seeing this happen in real time over the last few years, and it felt surreal.
It really did.
1 month, a product is supposed to do X, and the next month, it's perfectly normal that it only does Y. Walk us through the mechanics of how an institution pulls that off without losing credibility.
So the author labels this the Mutable Goalpost Protocol. and it's paired with what they call a semantic redefinition loop.
Mutable goalpost, meaning moving the goalposts.
Right. It relies on the assumption that success criteria can be continuously redefined post-outcome, without ever invalidating the initial marketing claims.
Oh, I see.
Let's trace the example provided in the text regarding the pandemic intervention. When it was first introduced, what was the definitive, highly publicized promise?
Well, the promise was unequivocal. It stops infection. You take the intervention, the virus stops with you. You become a dead end for the pathogen. That was the original finish line.
But then the empirical data started rolling in, and the reality was undeniable. The intervention was not stopping infection.
Right, people were still catching it.
People were still contracting the pathogen. So the institution executes the Mutable Goalpost Protocol. The claim shifts from stops infection to reduces transmission.
Okay, so the bar is lowered. But then the real-world data catches up again, and it turns out transmission is still happening at high rates.
So the goalpost moves a second time. Now, the narrative is that it lessens severity.
Right.
When that becomes statistically shaky, it moves to prevents hospitalization.
Right.
And eventually it rests on the ultimate vague catch-all. It saves lives.
What's wild to me is that each of these shifts is presented to the public not as a failure of the original product, but as a continuous natural evolution of scientific understanding.
Yes. They mask semantic slippage as evolving science.
Evolving science, wow.
And for this to work, it requires a compliant media to normalize the drift. And it relies on the public simply forgetting the original marketing language.
Which people often do.
They do. It creates an illusion of complete consistency. If you, as a citizen, point out that the product clearly doesn't stop infection, you are often accused of attacking a straw man argument.
Even though stopping infection was the literal televised promise just months prior.
Exactly.
It's like buying a fire extinguisher that doesn't put out fires. And when your kitchen burns down, the manufacturer says, well, evolving science shows our product is actually designed to make the ashes smell slightly better.
That's a great way to put it.
And if you complain, they say you just don't understand modern fire safety. But the text highlights an example that goes even further than just changing marketing slogans. They actually changed the dictionary definition of the product category itself.
This is the semantic redefinition loop in its purest form. The text notes that historically, the fundamental definitional requirement of a vaccine included the phrase producing immunity. But when the specific product failed to achieve that empirical standard in the real world, the definition was quietly updated by major health organizations to producing an immune response.
Wait, let's pause and look at that linguistically. Producing an immune response.
Yeah.
A splinter in your finger produces an immune response. Breathing in pollen during spring produces an immune response.
It does.
If the bar for success is merely your body noticed a foreign substance and reacted to it, then success is quite literally guaranteed.
By changing the dictionary definition, the institution makes it mathematically and legally impossible to say the product failed.
That is nuts.
This semantic shift means a product can claim total success even if it offers zero clinical protection to the patient, as long as it triggers some biological reaction.
And they just present this as science moving forward.
The conceptual drift is framed as epistemic advancement. They claim they are just being more precise with modern scientific language. But in reality, it is retrospective coherence. They are imposing a new definition onto a shifting target to avoid admitting defeat.
Which feels like rewriting the rules of chess while you're sitting in checkmate, just so you can say your king is legally allowed to fly off the board.
Pretty much.
But even with shifting definitions, you eventually have to explain why people are still getting sick. And that brings us to an excuse I heard constantly. The text calls it the Mutation Shield.
Right. Because when an intervention fails, the institution requires a scapegoat. The text points out that blaming viral mutations creates a perfectly closed, unfalsifiable logical loop.
Okay, explain that.
To understand why this is a trap, we have to look at the initial premise. The intervention was engineered to be highly targeted, specifically built for an ancestral spike protein of a virus.
Right.
But it is a well-established biological fact in virology that these specific types of respiratory viruses mutate incredibly rapidly.
Let me stop you right there because this is a crucial point. Are you saying the designers and the institutions knew fundamentally that this family of viruses is prone to rapid, continuous mutation?
Unquestionably, it is a foundational characteristic of coronaviruses. It is not a secret or a sudden surprise.
Okay, so if I build a roof out of cheap paper, I cannot act shocked when it inevitably rains.
No, you can't.
I can't look at my ruined living room and blame the rain for mutating into a thunderstorm to excuse my terrible engineering. If I know, as a biological or meteorological fact, that it is going to rain and my roof dissolves, my roof is a failure.
That is the exact structural critique the author makes. Building a highly targeted static product for a rapidly mutating dynamic virus means that failure is a predictable, built-in feature, not an anomaly.
Wow.
It's practically designed into the biology of this situation. But rhetorically, blaming a variant creates an unfalsifiable shield for the manufacturer.
It's the ultimate heads I win, tails you lose scenario.
Exactly. If the product appears to work against the old strain, the institution takes full credit. They say, the intervention is a miracle of modern science.
And if it fails?
If it fails completely against the new strain, they never say the product was flawed. They say the virus cheated, it mutated. It's not our product's fault, it's biology's fault.
But logically, if your intervention cannot account for the absolute most predictable behavior of its target, the intervention itself is fundamentally inadequate. You can't use the expected behavior of the pathogen as an ad hoc excuse to maintain your success metric. So why does the public accept this?
The text argues the public accepts it because nuanced scientific reality was stripped out of the messaging from day one.
Because of the PR?
Yes. The institutions treated a dynamic, ongoing biological arms race as if it were a static, permanent victory. They promised a knockout punch.
Right.
And when that victory didn't hold, instead of admitting the complexity of the science, they fell back on these linguistic traps to save face.
We've explored how they manipulate definitions, how they move the goalposts, and how they scapegoat the virus. But the text takes a significant turn here.
It does.
It argues that the manipulation goes far deeper than just PR and language. It's not just the words that get massaged, it's the raw foundational data itself. If the foundational trials are cracked, everything built on top of them is structurally compromised.
We are moving from the communication of science to the actual execution of the scientific method. The text dives deeply into the presumption of methodological purity and what it calls the data custody illusion.
The data custody illusion.
Yeah. And to illustrate this, the author points to a very specific real-world event. The disclosures brought forward by a whistleblower named Brooke Jackson regarding the Ventavia research group.
For those listening who might not remember the details of that story, let's set the stage. Ventavia was a massive clinical research contractor. They were managing several trial sites for the primary vaccine trials. And this whistleblower came forward with internal documents and photos showing severe protocol violations.
The disclosures were substantial. They revealed documented evidence of unblinding failures, improperly stored materials, falsified data entries, and a general lack of rigorous oversight at these specific trial sites.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about fundamental breaches of the rules that govern clinical trial integrity.
I want to focus on unblinding for a second. My understanding is that the entire bedrock of a randomized controlled trial is the double blind.
It is.
Neither the patient nor the doctor is supposed to know who got the real experimental drug and who got the saltwater placebo. If the blind is broken, if people know who got what, doesn't that immediately contaminate the data with human bias?
It shatters the foundation of objective observation. If the staff knows who received the active product, their recording of adverse events or efficacy can be consciously or subconsciously skewed.
Right, because they are expecting a certain result.
Exactly. Now, the critical part of this analysis isn't just that these violations happen. It's how the overarching institutions responded when the violations were exposed.
How did they respond?
They deployed what the text calls a scale of data argument.
How does that argument work to deflect the problem?
The institutions essentially looked at the disclosures and said, well, Ventavia only managed 3 out of the 153 trial sites. That translates to roughly 1,000 out of the 44,000 total participants.
Okay, so it's a small percentage.
Right. They argue that, statistically speaking, even if we throw out all of Ventavia's data, it is just a drop in the bucket. It doesn't invert the overall efficacy signal of the massive trial.
They minimize the scandal through sheer volume. They are telling the public, don't worry about this tiny fraction of bad data. The pile of good data is so much bigger.
But the text utterly dismantles this defense by pointing out a core philosophical truth about the scientific method. In clinical research, data integrity is not additive, it is foundational.
Let's really pull that apart. Not additive, but foundational. What does that distinction mean in practice?
It means that a clinical trial is essentially a chain of custody. Think of it like evidence in a major court case.
Yep.
If a trial sponsor and a massive regulatory body allow protocol violations and data falsification to occur at any site, and it takes a whistleblower to bring it to light, the entire chain of custody is broken.
I see.
You don't just subtract the bad data from the spreadsheet and happily move on. The fact that the oversight mechanism failed to catch it means the oversight mechanism itself is compromised.
To take your evidence analogy a step further, let's imagine a massive bridge inspection.
Okay, I like this.
You are driving across a mile-long suspension bridge. Suddenly, a whistleblower reveals that 2% of the steel beams in this bridge are actually made out of soggy, painted cardboard.
Terrifying.
Right. The city inspectors respond by saying, statistically, 98% of the bridge is solid steel, so it's perfectly safe. But the terrifying part isn't the 2% cardboard. The terrifying part is that the cardboard got approved at all.
Exactly.
It means the exact same inspection system that stamped approved on the cardboard also stamped approved on the steel.
That is a phenomenal visualization of the text's argument. If the regulatory oversight failed to catch severe violations at Site A, there is absolutely zero logical scientific basis to assume that the exact same oversight mechanism functioned flawlessly at Sites B, C, or D.
So, relying on the data from the other 150 sites without demanding a total, ground-up, independent audit of every single piece of paper isn't a scientific conclusion. It is blind faith.
It is an act of faith masquerading as science, and this is what the text means by the data custody illusion.
Data custody illusion, got it.
The institution points to an aggregated, generalized, top-level spreadsheet and declares the overall signal remains robust. They replace transparent, ground-level verification with technical jargon.
And they probably use that linguistic cascade we talked about to shut down critics.
Oh, absolutely. They use the linguistic cascade to make data skepticism appear anti-science. If you demand the raw data logs, you are framed as an obstructionist.
They elevate the paperwork over empirical reality. It's essentially saying, look, we have a heavily redacted PDF that concludes we did a great job. Stop asking to look inside the filing cabinets.
Yeah.
But here's the logical next question. If the foundational trial data has these potential cracks in it, how do these institutions manage the real-world data once the product is rolled out to hundreds of millions of people? Because once it's in the wild, you can't just hide bad results in a trial binder. Real people go to real hospitals.
This is where we enter what the text considers the most concerning territory. If you have a product with questionable foundational data, you have to manage its perception in reality.
How do they do that?
The institutions achieve this by manipulating the variables of time and measurement to effectively cook the books. The text identifies two massive structural data capture mechanisms used in the real world: the 14-day window reclassification and diagnostic asymmetry.
I want to really take our time here, because the 14-day window honestly blew my mind when I realized how it mathematically guarantees a certain outcome. Walk us through the chronological timeline of a patient under this rule.
So the a priori assumption, the rule established by health authorities before the real-world data is analyzed, is that a person is not considered officially vaccinated until 14 days after their final dose in the sequence.
Okay.
The stated biological rationale is that it takes the human immune system roughly 2 weeks to process the intervention and build optimal protection.
Okay, on a purely biological level, I can follow that logic. It takes time to bake the cake. Your body needs a couple of weeks to generate the antibodies. But how does this biological rationale become a statistical trap?
Watch how this rule is activated post-hoc to scrub the safety and efficacy databases. Let's imagine a patient. Let's call him David.
Okay, David.
David goes to a clinic and gets the intervention on Monday. On Thursday, just 3 days after the injection, David suffers a severe adverse event, let's say a catastrophic cardiac issue, and he is rushed to the hospital. How is David's medical event recorded in the grand statistical database?
Well, according to the 14-day rule, because he hasn't crossed that 2-week finish line, he is recorded as an unvaccinated patient.
He is recorded as unvaccinated, or sometimes status unknown.
Wow.
Now let's look at efficacy. What if David doesn't have a heart issue, but instead, 5 days after the injection, he catches the exact disease the product was supposed to protect him from?
Again, he hasn't hit day 14, so that infection is recorded as an unvaccinated infection.
The text explains the devastating statistical impact of this reclassification. It systematically captures two distinct types of product failure and reattributes them to the control group, the unvaccinated.
Let's break those down.
First, it actively scrubs early injuries from the product's safety profile. Any immediate acute reactions that happen in the days following the injection are statistically laundered into the background health rate of the unvaccinated population.
That is staggering. If the product harms you on day 3, the unvaccinated group takes the statistical blame.
Second, it completely hides periods of negative efficacy. Many medical interventions temporarily suppress or distract the immune system right after they are administered.
Oh, interesting.
If patients are highly vulnerable during those first 14 days and get severely ill, that failure is blamed on the unvaccinated state, rather than being recognized as a potential window of vulnerability caused by the intervention itself.
Let me make sure the listener is really grasping the magnitude of this. Under this accounting system, the product literally cannot fail in the first 2 weeks. Mathematically, it is invincible.
Unbeatable.
If it hurts you, it wasn't the product. It doesn't protect you, it wasn't the product. All the negative data generated in the first 14 days is scooped up and dumped onto the scorecard of the people who never took the product at all.
That is the genius and the danger of the 14-day window reclassification. It is a structural data capture mechanism that practically guarantees the intervention will look incredibly safe and effective because its most vulnerable period is erased from its ledger.
And the second trick you mentioned is diagnostic asymmetry. How does an institution rig the actual testing process?
This involves changing the sensitivity of the diagnostic test based on the patient's vaccination status. The text points specifically to guidance regarding PCR testing protocols early in the public rollout.
Let's do a quick primer on PCR tests for anyone who isn't a laboratory technician. Specifically, what is a cycle threshold or a heat?
Gladly. A PCR test is designed to look for genetic fragments of a virus in a sample. Because these fragments are microscopic, the machine amplifies the sample in cycles. It doubles the genetic material over and over.
Okay, I'm with you.
The cycle threshold is the number of times the machine has to double the sample before it finds the virus.
So if the machine only has to run a few cycles, say 15 cycles, that means there was a massive amount of the virus in the person's nose to begin with. It was easy to find.
Correct. That person is likely highly infectious. Conversely, a high number of cycles means there was very little viral material. The sample had to be amplified millions or even billions of times to trigger a detection.
Oh, wow.
At very high cycle thresholds, like 38 or 40, the machine is often just finding dead, fragmented viral debris from an old infection, not a live, replicating pathogen. In clinical terms, a cycle threshold of 40 often produces a false positive.
Okay, so the test essentially has a sensitivity dial. You can turn it up to find every microscopic dead fragment, or turn it down to only find active infections.
Exactly. Now, the diagnostic asymmetry highlighted in the text occurred when official guidance suggested running these PCR tests at lower cycle thresholds, say 28 cycles, when testing vaccinated individuals.
And for the unvaccinated?
For unvaccinated individuals, the laboratories were allowed to continue running the tests at the highly sensitive high cycle thresholds, up to 40.
Hold on, let's walk through the reality of that. If a vaccinated person gets tested, the lab only amplifies it 28 times. If they don't find the virus by cycle 28, the machine stops and the doctor says, "Congratulations, you are negative."
Yes.
But if an unvaccinated person walks into the same clinic with the exact same viral load, the lab amplifies their sample 40 times. They're looking for tiny dead fragments. And if they find a microscopic piece of debris at cycle 39, the doctor says, "You are positive."
You got the mechanics perfectly. That is diagnostic asymmetry. You're treating the exact same biological reality differently based on the patient's status.
That is, imagine organizing a 100-meter sprint with 2 runners. For the vaccinated runner, you quietly move the finish line 20 yards closer to the starting blocks. For the unvaccinated runner, you move the finish line 20 yards further away. The gun goes off, they run, and you point at the stopwatch and declare, "Look how much faster the first guy is. The intervention is a miracle."
It's rigged from the start.
You aren't measuring a biological difference in speed. You are literally just changing the ruler.
To take your racing analogy further, not only did you change the ruler, but you published the race times in a prestigious medical journal and used it to mandate that everyone must buy the first runner's shoes.
Oh my gosh.
By lowering the sensitivity for one group, you artificially manufacture data that proves the intervention stops infection. The text stresses that this is not an empirical scientific finding. It is overt data manipulation.
So they scrub the adverse events in the first 14 days, and they rig the diagnostic tests to ensure the product looks like it stops infection. That seems like an insurmountable wall of manipulated data.
It is, but the text goes even deeper. It explains that these overt tricks, the 14-day window, the PCR cycle thresholds, these are just the visible mechanics.
There's more.
Oh yeah, the true structural manipulation, the place where the most profound statistical illusions are created, happens in what the author called the dark matter of epidemiology, observational studies.
We're diving into observational studies now. This section of the text is incredibly dense, but it is the linchpin of the entire critique. Let's really take our time and unpack this. To start, what is the fundamental difference between the randomized clinical trials we discussed earlier and these observational studies?
In a randomized controlled clinical trial, an RCT, the scientists control the environment. They take a group of thousands of people and randomly assign them. Half get the drug, half get the placebo.
Okay.
That random assignment is the gold standard because it ensures that, on average, the two groups are identical. They have the same proportion of young people, old people, wealthy people, sick people, and healthy people. The only difference between the two groups is the intervention.
So if the group that got the drug lives longer, you can confidently say the drug caused it because all the other lifestyle factors cancel each other out.
Exactly. But an observational study is entirely different. In an observational study, the scientists don't control anything. They simply look back at massive troves of medical records out in the real world and observe what happened.
Right, because people are just living their lives.
Right. And the critical difference is that in the real world, people choose whether or not to take the medical intervention.
And human choice ruins that perfect random balance.
It completely destroys it. And to make these messy observational studies appear as rigorous as controlled trials, researchers have to mathematically adjust for what are called confounders.
Confounders.
A confounder is a hidden variable that influences both the patient's choice to get the treatment and their ultimate health outcome. The text lists several massive structural flaws, unadjusted confounders, that rig these observational studies before the first line of code is even written.
Let's walk through these biases one by one. The first one the author identifies is called the blank slate.
The blank slate is a structural assumption that completely ignores the existence of natural immunity. It treats every single person who hasn't received the pharmaceutical intervention as biologically naive.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it assumes their immune system is a blank slate, perfectly and equally susceptible to severe disease.
Which ignores the reality that millions of people might have already caught the pathogen, recovered, and developed robust natural antibodies.
Exactly. By erasing natural immunity from the baseline data, researchers artificially inflate the danger of being unvaccinated. It ensures that the pharmaceutical intervention appears to be the only possible mechanism for surviving the virus.
Okay, that makes sense. The next bias the text highlights is called Immortal Time Bias. The author describes this as a time travel trick, which sounds like science fiction. How does this manipulate the data?
Immortal time bias is a mind-bending statistical illusion. Let's pause and walk through a hypothetical patient's timeline to ensure we grasp how devious this is. Let's imagine a patient named Sarah.
All right, Sarah.
Sarah decides to get a multi-dose intervention. The medical protocol requires a first dose, followed by a 30-day waiting period, and then a second dose to be considered fully treated.
Okay, Sarah gets dose number 1 on March 1st. She is scheduled for dose number 2 on April 1st.
Now, what happens if Sarah walks out of the clinic on March 15th and gets hit by a bus? Or what if she catches a severe pneumonia and passes away on March 20th? In these massive observational databases, whose column does Sarah's death go into?
Based on the tricks we've seen so far, I'm guessing she doesn't count as a treated death because she didn't finish the protocol.
You're right. Because she didn't reach April 1st to get her second dose, her death is statistically dumped into the unvaccinated or inadequately vaccinated control group.
Oh, man.
But think about the profound implication this has for the fully treated cohort. To even make it into the fully treated spreadsheet on April 1st, a patient had to survive the entire month of March.
Oh my gosh, I see it. You literally had to be immortal during that 30-day waiting period to qualify for the treated group. If you die during the treatment phase, you get kicked out and your death is blamed on the untreated group.
That is the time travel trick. It creates an artificial survival advantage for the treated group that has absolutely nothing to do with the biology of the product. The treated group is guaranteed to have 0 deaths during that time window simply because anyone who dies is retroactively reclassified. It is a mathematical illusion that scrubs early mortality.
That is just, it's breathtakingly devious. The control group acts as a sponge for all the deaths that happen during the logistical rollout of the product. Okay, let's move to the next one. Confounding by indication. The text refers to this as the sick user mirror.
Confounding by indication occurs because doctors in the real world are humans making complex ethical and clinical choices. They do not distribute medical interventions randomly.
Right.
In reality, doctors will frequently withhold intense, novel, or reactive medical interventions from people who are extremely frail, in hospice care, or actively dying of other causes.
Right. If an 85-year-old patient is in the final stages of terminal cancer, a doctor isn't going to subject them to a harsh preventative treatment or an experimental drug. They are focused on palliative care.
Exactly. But consider what that ethical, compassionate choice does to the population-level statistics. It leaves the unvaccinated or untreated group filled to the brim with people who are already at death's door.
Oh, wow.
When those terminal patients inevitably pass away over the next few months, the sophist points to the raw spreadsheet and declares, "Look at the data. Being untreated is highly lethal."
When in reality, the causality is completely reversed. They remain untreated because they were already dying. The underlying sickness caused the lack of intervention, not the other way around.
That's the mechanic. They are essentially harvesting the background mortality of the frailest, sickest members of society to artificially inflate the danger of being in the control group.
That is so misleading.
It is. But as powerful as these biases are, the text argues they all pale in comparison to the focal point of observational epidemiology, the absolute king of structural flaws, the healthy user bias.
Let's dig deep into this, because the text suggests the healthy user bias invalidates almost all current population-level survival statistics. The author says this bias revolves around a false assumption called exchangeability.
Exchangeability is the flawed premise that the treated group and the untreated group in the real world are fundamentally identical. It assumes that if you magically swapped their vaccination statuses, their health outcomes would magically swap too.
Basically assuming all other things are equal.
Right. It assumes the only variable dictating their lifespan is the injection.
Which, if you spend 5 minutes observing human behavior out in the real world, is laughably false.
It is entirely disconnected from reality.
Yeah.
Because people who proactively seek out medical interventions, who comply with health mandates, who schedule regular checkups, and who take daily vitamins, these compliers are statistically fundamentally different from those who don't.
In what ways?
They are vastly more health conscious, they have better diets, they're less likely to smoke, they generally have higher socioeconomic status, lower stress environments, and critically, better access to baseline health care.
So let's paint a picture of how this mathematically ruins a study. Imagine someone who eats a kale salad for lunch every day, goes to yoga 3 times a week, works a comfortable, low-stress work-from-home job, and eagerly takes the new medical intervention.
Okay, perfect example.
They survive the winter without getting severely ill. Under the rules of these massive observational studies, the institution credits 100% of that person's survival advantage to the pharmaceutical product.
That is the exact trap. The statistical model completely ignores the kale, the yoga, the low stress, the financial stability, and the excellent healthcare access.
You don't control for it at all.
The healthy user bias captures all of those general, lifelong health advantages and funnels them directly into the efficacy score of the product. It credits the drug for the benefits of an affluent, health-conscious lifestyle.
The text mentions a crazy telltale sign of this bias in the wild. It says that if you read these studies closely, they sometimes show the intervention preventing things it biologically couldn't possibly prevent.
Yes, this is the ultimate proof that the data is compromised. Sometimes large observational studies will inadvertently show that the vaccinated group has a drastically lower rate of dying from car accidents or falling off ladders or suffering from entirely unrelated cancers.
Obviously, an injection in your arm does not stop you from slipping on a ladder or getting T-boned in an intersection.
Exactly. When a rigorous, honest scientist sees that data, they immediately throw up their hands and say, our study is fundamentally flawed. Our treated group isn't surviving because of the drug. They are just generally safer, wealthier, and healthier people. Our data is hopelessly confounded.
But according to the text, a captured institution doesn't throw the study out.
No. Instead of adjusting for the bias, they leverage it. They use that massive generalized survival advantage to pad the all-cause mortality statistics, making the intervention look like an absolute miracle of science. They transform a correlational lifestyle advantage into a causal illusion.
The text calls the resulting product a golden boy. Once you apply the healthy user bias to funnel lifestyle benefits to the drug, and you use the Immortal Time Bias to delete early deaths, and you use confounding by indication to dump all the terminal hospice patients into the control group, the intervention becomes this unassailable golden boy. It looks statistically invincible.
Because the golden boy isn't actually found in the raw, messy reality of biology. It is entirely constructed by the study design.
Okay, but this brings up a massive real-world problem for the institutions. Once the intervention is crowned the golden boy using this flawed observational data, it essentially becomes too big to fail. Billions of dollars and entire political legacies are tied to it.
Absolutely.
So how does the institution defend the golden boy when people actually start getting hurt in the real world? When the adverse events start piling up and doctors are seeing actual injuries, how do they maintain the illusion?
This is where we examine the epistemological asymmetry of the risk-benefit scale. The text argues that the scale is structurally rigged so that the abstract benefit of the product will always outweigh the tangible harm.
And how do they rig the scale?
The foundation of this rigged scale starts with a maneuver called the null hypothesis inversion.
Wait, my understanding of basic high school science is that you assume a drug does absolutely nothing until you can definitively prove it works. You start from a baseline of 0. Are you saying they flip that foundational rule completely backwards?
That is exactly what the author argues. In rigorous science, the null hypothesis is king. Prove to me this chemical does something beneficial. But institutions pull what the text calls a sophist flip.
A sophist flip.
Because of the incredibly flawed observational data we just discussed, the product is granted what is called axiomatic efficacy. It is assumed to be miraculously life-saving by default.
It transitions from being a scientific hypothesis to being a sacred truth.
And once you invert that null hypothesis, you build a fortress against any reports of harm. Because the benefit is assumed to be virtually infinite, any real-world injury is immediately met with a defense. Yes, this heart condition is tragic, but the overarching benefit of saving the world still outweighs it.
Which brings us to perhaps the most insidious, unprovable argument of all. The text calls it the counterfactual infallibility trap, or more commonly, the would-have-been-worse argument. I've heard this 1,000 times.
The author refers to this as the logical ghost. Let's look at the real-world application. Imagine a vaccinated person contracts the virus and ends up in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. The product clearly, empirically, failed to protect them from severe disease. But instead of logging it as a failure, the institution or the doctor responds, yes, they are on a ventilator, but without the intervention, they would have died sooner or suffered even more.
But how can they possibly scientifically know that?
They can't. That is the entire point. You cannot scientifically prove causality in a single individual in an alternate timeline. You cannot run a simulation of the exact same person with the exact same immune system on the exact same Tuesday exposed to the exact same viral load without the intervention.
So they are debating against a ghost. They are using an imaginary timeline to excuse a physical failure.
It transforms a concrete clinical failure, the patient is literally suffocating in a hospital bed, into a speculative success. We avoided an invisible worse death. By invoking an imaginary timeline where the outcome is always universally catastrophic without the drug, the efficacy claim becomes completely unfalsifiable.
And you can never win a debate against an imaginary timeline. If I take a headache pill, and 5 minutes later I get a massive migraine, and the doctor says, well, without the pill, your head would have literally exploded, I can't prove my head wouldn't have exploded. The doctor wins the argument by default, not by science, but by playing make-believe.
Now, when this infinite counterfactual benefit is weighed against actual physical harms like myocarditis or blood clots, the text highlights a profound ethical and statistical issue called risk asymmetry normalization.
This involves comparing natural risk versus iatrogenic risk.
Yes, iatrogenic risk is the harm caused directly by a doctor, a hospital, or a pharmaceutical intervention. Natural risk is the baseline harm caused by encountering a pathogen in the wild environment.
Right.
The institutions frequently conflate the two to dismiss severe side effects. They will tell the public, yes, the intervention causes severe cardiac issues in young men at a rate of X, but catching the virus causes those same issues at a rate of Y, which is higher. Therefore, the medical risk is justified.
I really want to pause and challenge this institutional logic, because mathematically it feels incredibly manipulative. They are comparing a 100% certainty of an event to a random environmental probability.
Expand on that. What do you mean by 100% certainty?
If an institution mandates an injection to keep your job, or heavily coerces you to take it to participate in society, your exposure to the iatrogenic risk The medical risk of the drug is 100%.
It's true.
The needle goes into your arm. You are guaranteed to face the side effects, whatever they are, but your exposure to the natural risk isn't 100%. You might live in a rural area, you might have robust natural immunity, you might just get lucky and never cross paths with the virus.
The text absolutely supports your challenge. It points out that comparing a guaranteed medical exposure to a theoretical environmental probability is a fundamental category error.
It strips the individual of their bodily autonomy and their unique environmental context and replaces it with a generalized statistical abstraction. It forces an individual to take a guaranteed risk to avoid a hypothetical one.
And that leads directly to how they process the data when those guaranteed risks materialize. The text calls this the causality burden double standard. Notice how the concept of correlation is treated entirely differently depending on whether the outcome's good or bad.
It's a one-way valve for data.
Exactly. For the presumed benefits, correlation effortlessly equals causation. If a vaccinated person gets a mild cold and survives, the intervention gets 100% of the credit immediately. The correlation is unquestioned.
And for the bad outcomes.
But for the harms, correlation suddenly does not equal causation. If a perfectly healthy 20-year-old athlete drops dead 24 hours after receiving the injection, the institution says, that's just a tragic coincidence. We need 10 years of peer-reviewed mechanistic studies, tissue samples, and double-blind trials to prove causality.
So positive outcomes flow like water into the benefit bucket, but negative outcomes hit a massive brick wall of skepticism and are trapped in the awaiting proof bucket forever.
And if, by some miracle, a severe negative outcome does manage to get scientifically proven and acknowledged, the institution deploys a final math trick called statistical laundering to dilute the impact of the injury.
The Denominator Trick. Walk us through how they turn a tragedy into statistical noise.
Let's say 10,000 young men suffer a severe adverse event, like heart inflammation, shortly after the intervention. To any honest safety statistician, a cluster of 10,000 specific injuries in a specific demographic is a massive, blaring red alarm. It demands an immediate halt.
Obviously.
But the institution doesn't compare those 10,000 injuries to the specific cohort of young men who received the product. Instead, they dilute the injury by comparing it to the entire population of the country, the massive denominator.
They take 10,000 and divide it by 330 million people.
Exactly. They throw the elderly, the women, the children, and the unexposed into the denominator. And suddenly, a severe concentrated injury signal becomes 1 in a million. It becomes statistically invisible on a chart. They mathematically launder the localized human harm into generalized background noise.
So, if we look at the grand scale, we have an unprovable, imaginary ghost benefit on one side, and we have real, physical human harms that are being diluted, denied, and blamed on coincidences on the other side.
That's the setup.
But eventually the dam breaks. When the public starts noticing these glaring double standards, when they see their own family members getting injured, or they realize the definitions are changing on the evening news, what is the institution's final line of defense? How do they handle the late-stage crisis when the public loses faith?
That brings us to the final chapters of the text: institutional defense mechanisms and the invocation of the greater good. When the public wakes up to the discrepancies and the sheer scale of the manipulation, the institution initiates crisis maneuvers. The first maneuver is what the author terms communication error deflection.
This is where they throw the PR team under the bus to save the scientists, right?
Precisely. When the policies fail spectacularly, or the empirical claims are totally contradicted by reality, the core scientific institutions absolutely refuse to admit methodological failure. Doing so would destroy their authority. Instead, they sacrifice the peripheral actors. They blame the news media or local politicians or their own communication departments.
They pivot and say, oh, the underlying science was always flawless, our methodology was perfect, the messaging was just unfortunately confusing for the layman, we just didn't communicate the nuance well enough.
Yes, they bifurcate the issue. By admitting to a communication error, they protect the core scientific narrative from actual scrutiny. They separate the experts from the messengers.
But the experts were the messengers. The heads of these massive public health agencies were the ones on television every single night, giving the absolute non-nuanced messaging. They used the science as a rhetorical bludgeon to justify firings and mandates. You cannot turn around 3 years later, wipe your hands, and say, oh, the media misinterpreted our highly nuanced data.
The text agrees completely. It identifies this as the ultimate masking technique. It makes structural critique appear misdirected. But when even the communication deflection fails to quell the public anger, The institution relies on the most powerful psychological and social tool they have, consensus as truth.
Ah, yes, the classic appeal to authority. All the major experts agree, so it must be true.
The text explains how social coordination is conflated with empirical truth. Institutional agreement across agencies and universities is presented as epistemic validity. They substitute peer pressure for peer review.
But consensus isn't the scientific method. History is overflowing with times when the consensus of the brightest minds on Earth was dead wrong.
Exactly. But rhetorically, if you frame the intervention not just as a medical product but as a social contract, you completely change the rules of engagement.
How so?
Well, a medical product can be evaluated objectively. It has risks and benefits. A social contract is a moral obligation to your fellow citizens.
Right, it becomes do it to protect your neighbor, do it for the greater good.
And once a medical product is framed as the greater good, acknowledging any harm it causes becomes a form of moral heresy. If a scientist or a citizen admits the product causes severe injuries, they are accused of endangering the collective. They are labeled selfish.
So the unfalsifiable benefit we talked about earlier acts as an impenetrable moral shield.
Yes, the sophists at the top can downplay real, devastating injuries, not because they aren't happening, but because acknowledging them would collapse the entire moral simulation that justifies their vast authority.
The simulation. That word perfectly brings us to the final, chilling concept in the text, the ultimate ghost metric that institutions use to write their own history, the lives saved simulation.
This is the capstone of the unfalsifiable narrative. How does an institution mathematically prove it succeeded when the real-world death tolls are catastrophic? How do they claim victory when reality looks like a defeat?
By creating a worst-case counterfactual computer model.
Yes. They build an epidemiological model, assuming their intervention is the absolute only thing standing between humanity and total extinction. They program the model to project an apocalyptic death toll. And then, when reality occurs and only 2 million people die, they subtract reality from their computer model and boldly claim to the press, our product saved 18 million lives.
It is circular proof. The computer model is programmed with the assumption that the vaccine is the only thing that works, so any survival is automatically credited to it. They are using completely imaginary numbers generated by their own algorithms to silence real, concrete injuries in the physical world.
When a citizen points out that thousands of young people suffered heart damage, the institution responds, how can you selfishly complain about 10,000 injuries when our models prove we saved 18 million lives?
Wow.
It crushes dissent using a mathematical ghost. It is the ultimate weaponization of the unobservable.
It is a perfectly closed logical system. The benefit is infinite because it's imaginary, and the harm is negligible because it's diluted by the denominator. The house always wins. The definitions shift when they fail. The data is scrubbed in a 14-day window. The PCR cycles are rigged to change the finish line. The healthy users are exploited to create a golden boy. And any lingering failures are blamed on viral mutations or poor PR.
And that sequential mechanism, functioning together, is the linguistic cascade of capture.
It is breathtaking to see it all laid out like that. It is a terrifying masterclass in bureaucratic survival at the complete expense of scientific truth.
It is sobering, which is exactly why the author of the text doesn't just leave us with the critique. They end the document with a strategic dismantling protocol. They offer a way out of the cascade.
And we desperately need that way out because realizing how thoroughly the data is manipulated can feel incredibly overwhelming. So as we move into our recap and takeaways, let's summarize this protocol for the listener. How do you defeat this linguistic cascade when you see it happening on the news?
The very first step is realizing that you do not need to be anti-science to do this. In fact, demanding rigorous, transparent science is the antidote. The text advises readers to target the functional requirements of an argument, not the conclusions. Ask yourself, what must mathematically be true for this claim to hold?
Demand the raw data. When an institution hands you a glossy, aggregated PDF that says everything is fine, ask for the chain of custody logs. Ask if there was a Ventavia-style breakdown in the trial. Refuse to accept pooled abstractions and technical jargon as a substitute for empirical proof.
To add to that, you must proactively identify and call out the structural biases. When an agency claims massive real-world success in an observational study, ask if they controlled for the healthy user bias. Ask if they captured the lifestyle advantages of the treated group. Ask if they scrubbed early adverse events using a 14-day window.
And third, reject the counterfactual ghosts outright. When a doctor, a politician, or a public health official looks at a failure and tells you, well, it would have been worse without it, recognize that for what it is. A logical fallacy. Demand observed event rates and absolute risk reductions, not subjunctive, imaginary timelines generated by a computer model.
And finally, name the linguistic mechanisms out loud when you hear them. When a spokesperson says evolving science, recognize it as a mutable goalpost. When they say a severe injury is statistically insignificant, recognize it as a statistical alibi designed to dilute human suffering into the denominator.
Reclaiming your epistemic sovereignty. That's the phrase the text uses, and I love it. Why does this matter for the person listening right now? Because in a world of absolute information overload, understanding these lingual and statistical traps is your armor. It protects you from being manipulated by fear and by institutions that demand blind faith while hiding the raw data in a vault. Science is supposed to be about falsification. It is supposed to be about rigorously trying to prove your own theories wrong. It is not supposed to be a rhetorical shield for institutional immunity.
True scientific skepticism defends methodology. Sophistry defends narratives. By understanding the profound taxonomy we explore today, you transition from being a passive consumer of public health messaging to an active auditor of institutional logic.
And that brings us to a final, provocative thought I want to leave you with, something for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the massive, unprecedented leaps in biotechnology happening right now. mRNA, CRISPR, personalized genomics, neural implants. If our modern metrics of safety and efficacy rely on a bureaucratic system that can simply change the dictionary definition of words to avoid admitting failure, how can we ever accurately evaluate the true risks of the next paradigm-shifting medical technology?
If the scale is structurally rigged to ensure the golden boy always wins and the greater good always trumps individual harm, we lose the ability to see the dangers until it is far too late.
It brings us right back to that X-ray from the very beginning of our deep dive. We desperately want to believe the institutions are handing us a clean, black and white image of reality. We want to trust the doctor pointing at the screen. But when the machine is built on unfalsifiable assumptions and the contrast dial is constantly being adjusted by the PR department, you aren't looking at an X-ray anymore. You're looking at a painting. And it's up to you to figure out what they decided to leave off the canvas. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data, keep exploring the hidden assumptions, and never surrender your right to demand the raw truth. We'll see you on the next one.